A very good evening and welcome to the broadcast. This evening we are going to explore what day zero means to you and I, why the date is a moving target, and what impact that will have on our lives and for the economy of Cape Town. I'm your host, Bridgetti Banda from Cape Town in South Africa, and welcome to the broadcast. This evening I have two guests with me. First is Benoit Le Roy. Welcome, Benoit. Benoit is a chemical engineer with over 30 years experience across many different sectors, and Benoit is not new to any of you. He's been on the broadcast many times. A very special welcome to a guest, Tom Brown. Tom, welcome. Tom is a retired international businessman with a background in IT and finance, and he's got a special interest in water matters. Tom's interest in climate matters started while he was still a relatively young man. He studied many facets of water over the years. He's not a specialist, but very much a feet-on-the-ground pragmatist. He started writing Show Me viewers about the water situation in Cape Town almost 3 years ago when he perceived the possibility of a major water problem developing, and turns out he was right. Since then, Show Me has evolved into his weekly Cape Water and Dam report, and there are many of us who rely on that report. So we wait for it with great expectation every single week. And that has got a reach of to 250,000 people on social media and is read by 8,000 to 12,000 people every week. So it's got wide coverage. Tom, big welcome to the broadcast to you too.
Thanks, Bridgetti.
So today we're discussing day zero, and a lot of people are battling with what day zero is all about. And one of the main reasons for that is that day zero was announced, first of all, and created a lot of fear in people. And everyone started saving like crazy. And then the date moved and the date kept moving. And the last move was about by a month. And many people are struggling to understand what that's all about. Tom?
I seem to have lost you, Bridgetti.
Yeah, she seems to have disappeared. I'm sure she'll be back.
Hi.
Maybe we should talk amongst ourselves in the meantime.
A little technical glitch there. So Tom, I was asking, I'm back.
We were going to take over.
Go for it. Be my guest.
No.
So what I was going to ask is Tom, can you explain to us why day zero has been such a moving target, and why was it pushed out by a month? Does it mean that it's no longer a serious threat to us? What is the reasoning behind it?
I think, Bridgetti, the best thing to do is to just zero actually is. Back in October of last year, the Cape Town Metro announced a disaster plan designed really to deal with the growing crisis that we have down here in Western Cape. And that plan had 3 phases, what they called the water supply throttling phase, which was basically being dealt with by pressure reduction management. Phase to that was what they called day zero, which was stage 2, if you like. And that was the point at which the taps to the residential homes in the metro area. And the term day zero is really a bit of a misnomer. To me, the dams are completely empty, but they decided to coin day zero as the phrase for when they stopped supplying water through the taps. So essentially what happened is that in endeavoring to work out more or less when it would happen, they endeavored to calculate or to estimate, and they published that date. And of course, what then happened was that date started to move around, because every time the consumption changed, the consumption decreased, then the date tended to move outwards. And if the consumption increased, the date tended to move inwards. So you had this date which was hopping around. The levels of the dams were still slowly falling steadily, but sometimes a little bit more quickly and sometimes a little bit early, being reflected in the changing date associated with day zero. So day zero is not a date, it's not even a deadline, it's actually an which would arise when the levels of the dams fall to a point where the authorities believe that the risk is too high to continue. At that moment in time, take a firm decision to shut off the water flow to the households in the Cape Metro. Date of day zero will then be known because it will be the date on which that happens. But beforehand, well, we will not actually know what it will be.
So just to reiterate, day zero, you're saying, is not a specific date. And I think the confusion possibly started because the city initially announced that a week before they turn off the taps, they will announce this big day, day zero. And I think that initial explanation has kind of stuck in our heads. And so we're all waiting for this big announcement. But now what you're saying is that it's not a specific date, it's a condition or a set of conditions that triggers day zero events.
Well, that's absolutely right. And obviously the council have to try that would be, but I think publishing it was basically a bit of a mistake because it changes all the time. And the strange thing about it is that it, without direct reference to the amount of water that is being consumed in the metro. So the metro puts out a number of different figures. One is the average number of liters, millions of liters of water that have been used per day across the previous week. That figure is around about 500 million liters. Now that figure can go up and down, and it doesn't necessarily affect day zero because that reflects the drawing from the dams. But the calculation of day zero is based on the condition of the dams themselves. So the dams reach collectively a particular level that they would have to decide that the risk is too high and that they need to do something about it. But we're not the only ones who draw water in agriculture, and there are the other big metros. And of course, there's evaporation. So in fact, the metro, the Cape Metro, probably only use end of the water from the dams. The rest is used by those other entities. And to the extent that they use more or less, that is. So even if the usage in the metro was dead constant, you could find that day zero moves around simply because other people, or alternatively, it's been very hot and there's been a lot of evaporation, for example.
So those are specific reasons why day zero keeps changing and why it's a moving target. Benoit, if I may ask you, has the movement of day zero caused any interruption in the business sector?
I think because of the way, as Tom said, the way it's been communicated initially, which was incorrect, but in hindsight we always 100%, is that there's little credibility attached to it. So one of the difficulties we have is in trying to convince business that we have a real situation here, and I call it ground zero. We're at ground zero in the world where 4 million people could run out of water, and business has to plan for the worst, and hopefully it doesn't happen. Although I personally have my doubts. I think it's going to happen, but there's a lot of inputs into calculating when this phase will happen. But I think what's really disturbing at the moment is that we're on rations of 50 liters per person per day. We have agriculture that is considerably down. The yields are down roughly 20%. but the water was cut down by 40 to 60%. So we'll feel those effects, I think, next year, but the effects this year already 20% from last year. So we're already in a situation where we're on 50 liters per person per day. And when you're in a business, people are focusing about water and the lack thereof and the difficulties as opposed to actually the job at hand. And I think we need to look at business in three categories at least. So we've got general business, then we've got agriculture, which really feeds the food and beverage chain, which some have started up, some haven't. So we've got already job losses, and we've got supply chain knock-on effects happening already. And then we've got tourism, for example, which is a great employer of semi-skilled and unskilled to a great extent. And the tourist is not worried about 50 liters per person per day. They will shower, they will bath, etc. And they're not really the issue, but we need to get them, into the region to spend their rands, their dollars, and the likes. And at 50 liters per person per day, for those who are not tourists, it's a very small amount of water. We have areas that have run out of water purely because they're in the low pressure zones, whilst the pressure is being, subjected to extreme reduction. So we've got 50 liters per day online. I firmly believe that one of the in-between plans will be not to go to day 0 or 25 liters at collection points immediately, will be to go to maybe 25 liters per person per day or 30 liters, but through the tap. And whilst this is happening, I believe business cannot operate in general normally. And this has been now for a month. I think after 2 months or 3 months, as day 0 gets pushed out, and some feel we're not going to hit it, I think the toll is going to hit, and has hit part of the economy, is going to start hitting us and start hitting general productivity. And what happens is, like water flows downhill, unless you force it, economics, business, finance moves to where it's easier. And that impact, I think, we have not felt yet, but it is going to start biting hard. And the realization that day 0 is not the issue. The issue is 50 liters per person per day. And for how long are we going to have that?
Tom, do you have a comment on that? What's your sense about?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that the critical issue here is establish what a minimum would be that we could get by with. And the figure that I've been touting for a while now is that if we could get to the end of June, 100 million cubic meters of water still in the dams, pardon me, then we would have had enough to, because essentially that's all we've got to do at the moment. Moving day 0 around between June, July, and August makes no sense, really, because as long as once it starts to rain and the dams start to recharge, day 0 by definition gets deferred. It's then not going to happen until a moment in time. Where Benoit is absolutely correct is if we get to the end of June and the levels drop below in the dams, it is the safety level, and let's take 100 million cubic meters of water for a moment, then the problem becomes that we have to switch to rationing, the mechanism, stage 2 mechanism, which is collection of water, collection and rationing of water at 25 liters per person per day, because we would have left available to us in the dams only about 45 million cubic meters of water. And what you have to bear, that water would possibly last us something like about the end of October. Is that they would try to reduce the amount of water which is then supplied from the dams, if you like, to about 300 to 350. 150 million liters, or half of that, would be kept supplied to businesses and industry to try to keep business the authorities have declared that that is one of their objectives. So at the very least, people can still go to work, do their jobs, and collect their incomes. And as far as normal areas are concerned, they also will see no change because they're effectively already at day zero. They go and queue up at pipes and stuff like that to get their water and carry it home. So it's going to change effectively for those 65% of the people out there. They're the ones who have to then go and collect their water and cart that home with them. Now, if we do that at that moment in time, 6th of June, then effectively, if you work out the numbers, it should last us through until about the end of October. What you mustn't forget is that there will be evaporation. So we might have about 45 million cubes available, but about 9 to 10 of those are going to just disappear automatically. So what's left is not actually all that much, and it provides us with about 300 million liters a day through until about the end of October. What would be important about that is that obviously that would keep us all in survival mode, but giving us the opportunity to get more rain. So even if we don't get rain by the end of June, we'll probably get it in July or in August. And once the rains have fallen and the dams have refilled to some extent, to do a completely new set of calculations and work out what we need to do next in order to get out into the future. But of course, augmentation will be starting to come on last moment with the aquifers and things like that, but we can talk about that separately.
And of course, if we don't get the expected rainfall come June or July, that's also going to have an impact, isn't it? I'm not sure if you heard, just doing a sound check. I'm not sure if you heard me.
I just heard a snatch or two of it, not very much at all.
Okay. So if for example, we don't get the expected rainfall, and considering, I think the farmers' allocation starts again in September, isn't it? I speak under correction, Tom?
Yeah, it would normally start in about October.
It's October. Okay. So hopefully we will get some rain come June, July, August. But if we don't, we can see that date moving forward again, surely, isn't it?
Well, I think the situation is this. Let's assume for a moment that we set this target, the survival target. We need to get to the end of 100 million cubic meters in the dams. And let's say that we get to the end of June, and that's what we have. So we've actually succeeded. Let's assume for a moment that there's been no rain in April, May, and June. We would then be faced with a situation of saying we must now stage 2 and commence rationing because we're not sure if and when we're going to get rain. That makes sense. And at that stage of the game, those reserves will stay until about the end of October. Now, somewhere between June and October, it's going to rain. If it doesn't rain at all, well, then we all need to start emigrating away from Cape. If it does rain, to whatever extent it rains, it's likely to put water into the dams, and therefore the calculations will change at that point. I did the sums a bit, and in 2017, between June, the second week of June, and the second week of October, the dams of 166 million cubic meters of water. Okay, so if we started a session like that with 100 in the dams, you would do this. But of course, because we're using less water this year than we used last year, there would be an extra amount as well. So if we got just the same amount of rain as we're going to end up, I would think, sort of at the end of October with about 300 million cubic meters of water in the dams. And 65 liters per person per day, that water will last us through until the following winter.
That's that kind of summarizes it quite nicely. Thank you. But either way, we're in for a difficult time. My concern is always just that because we've moved day zero out, people may not be taking this seriously enough and start using more water, in which case, because currently we're still not meeting the target. We're still about 100 over the target. And if people, I mean, I've spoken to a few people this week, and almost without fail, every single person I spoke to said they're no longer taking day zero seriously. And the concern with that is that consumption may start rising exponentially because of the lack of understanding. And that's why I thought this conversation was an important one to have. And we probably would need to have more conversations like these to help people understand that even if the date gets moved somewhat for the reasons that you mentioned, it doesn't lessen the threat, and that we should continue saving water.
Bridgetti, the point that I've been making to the authorities about this is people aren't expected to understand what the calculation basis is to day zero. It's really a statistical aberration that because the dams, the level of the dams is still dropping. It's dropping slower than it was, and obviously because all the distribution has been terminated, that has made a big difference, as has also the water that has been coming in from the Kogelberg Reserve from others. But that's only going to last for another few weeks, and then the consumption will go up again. And when the consumption effectively goes up again, quickly the dams are dropping. So if the dams don't drop as fast as they have been for the last weeks, then it will appear that the consumption and effectively day zero will get nearer again. But nothing's happened to the dams. The dams are still continuing to diminish. And that's why it's better to think in terms of a target. And that's why I keep on saying 100 million cubic meters of water by the end of June. That's what we should be aiming for. Or if you 99 by 629, okay, so 99 million cubes by the 29th of June, 99 by 629. Then we will have done fine in between. We will have met all of our targets, and we will have a decent reserve. And in the past, you always get, and that rain always tends to fall in the catchments. So we will see some refilling of the dams. It's only a question is how much. And we've got to continue with restricted use all the way to the following winter. There's no question about it. But if, on the other hand, we get good rains, then the dams will start to reach 3 to 4 years of normal rainfall to get back up to 100%.
Tom, just a question on the dams. Currently, they are trying to dredge the last 10% of the dam. Do you foresee any difficulties with that?
The Department of Water and Sanitation people have been saying to me for a long time, the 10% is just it's just a figure that people use, part of the water, the bottom end of the dam, if you like, which they consider to be dead water. And they do some other reasons is that it's in a shallow dam that's very muddy water, and that water is far more difficult to filter and clean. The water from Full Flay tends to be like that, but the water from the mountain dams like Famous Hook and Berg River, that water is good all the way to they can, if they have to, they can run those dams dry. Now, they don't want to do that because there's an ecology involved, and there are water from those dams other than Cape Town. So the essence of the thing at the moment is the department is trying to do the dams to be able to get down to about 6 or 7%. And they feel that that's a reasonable level that will put another month's supply roughly into the and at the same time that will make sure, you know, that you don't have stagnant water, developing a lot of algae and fish dying in the water as a result of that. That can take a long time to fix afterwards. So they'll try to keep a certain amount of water in the dams, but they can certainly get down below 10%. 10%, that means the point at which the authorities would cut off supply to the taps can also go down. At the moment, the Metro 13.5% of capacity. That's about 120 million cubic meters of water in the dams. But if, on the other hand, dams down to, let's say, 60 million cubes, then that would leave a total reserve of 60, which is probably more than we need to have. So they can probably continue to supply water through the taps for a while longer. And every week that they go further into the year is another week that we get close. Now, I should point out one other thing, Bridgetti, and that is that there is a press conference tomorrow, which I shall be at midday, hosted by Alderman Ian Nielsen and Xanthia Limburg, and they're going to talk to the subject again. And I think they've come to realize that their past emphasis on this term day zero has been a little bit exaggerated. And a more relaxed way of looking at it. And I think perhaps getting closer to the idea that I put out there. Let's rather have a target, an unmoving towards, rather than worrying about a date which bounces backwards and forwards without any real clear logic to it.
Thanks for that explanation. Benoit, if I can ask you, in terms of business confidence, have we seen an effect on business confidence since we've gotten to 50 litres?
Before I answer that, if I may, Tom, you're talking about volume. We're not talking about quality. And one of the big unknowns we have is, what is the water quality going to be? Because we don't run these dams to these levels normally. And I think we have a potential choke where the water treatment plants will be unable potentially to treat the load, the pollution load, or the biological load, the bloom load, whatever the load is, be it turbidity and the likes, if you don't have good enough rains. So everybody's focusing on the volume. So volume is one thing, but I think the quality is the other. And to add to that, I think the quality will be affected, and the volumes, because of the water network in Cape Town being subjected to varying pressures on an ongoing basis, and the extreme pressures now, not the normal overnight pressure reductions. So the water quality could get to a stage where there's a blockage in the treatment works and or blockage in the reticulation system, where there's so much ingress that the water cannot be used safely from a potable perspective. This is an unknown at the moment. So I think we need to start bringing an element of the unknown from a quality perspective, in that we might have the volume, but we might not have the quality available.
Well, I think that's a possibility. You being a chemical engineer, you would understand that. The two things that stick in my mind as far as quality is concerned, but one, that is that there is a standard, and the requirement is for 98% or better of that standard all the time. And I think what they're maintaining across all the different delivery systems in the southwestern Cape is about 99.4, 99.5. So at this stage of the game, they're still substantially above the minimum quality acceptable. The second point that occurs to me is that I would expect that we will have a difference in the quality from the deep dams. And when I talk about deep dams, I mean like Steenbos and Vermershoek, and because the deep water there is a long way away from the sun right at the moment, and therefore it's likely to be of a better inherent quality. Plus, it's also load in those dams, and therefore the water will be less cloudy. And if you look at what the authorities are doing, they are tending to hold back the mountain dams, and they're tending to run down Theewaterskloof and Voorvlei. They do that also, of course, because those dams suffer the most if ever lost day to day from those dams. But I think they're also doing it because they need to get those down to that level, I guess, and see whether or not they will be able to use them.
I didn't get that last bit from Tom.
I think we lost a bit of sound there, Tom. Do you mind repeating the last bit?
Okay. Yes, all I was saying is that the authorities are tending to run down the big Chalet and Teerwaterskloof, and they are maintaining the maximum amount of water in the deeper lands like Steenbos, like Vemershoek, and like Berg River. Because I believe that the quality is also better in those dams inherently, there is less of us, and therefore that water is likely to be easier to filter. But Benoit, open to your comment on that.
Yeah, no, that explains a lot, and I think from a city perspective, they should consider talking about quantity and quality, because there's a lot of rumors going around that the water's not fit and all the likes, and it is. I think there's temporary cloudiness because of some breaks in the network that are being repaired. And yesterday was a big one in Philippi and the surrounds. It doesn't mean the water's like that all the time. But I think, just from a communication perspective, I agree with you with giving a fixed volume as the target. So it takes the date out. The date is a function of a whole lot of inputs. And also from a quality perspective, that we have this volume target and we are within the SANS 241 98%. We're running at 99%. And why we're going to stay above it is because we're going to take better quality water from the deeper dams and the likes. I think that goes a long way to engendering confidence in the general public. From a business perspective, Bridgetti, it's difficult to say because we're hearing different things from the different sectors. So the agricultural sector is hit, we know that, but there is a lag. So the food processors, there are some that haven't opened, that are seasonally opened. There are some that work all year round, and they're not talking. So I'm talking about the large multinationals who process various foods and the high value stuff. And the question is, they're also not telling us, generally speaking, they don't want their competitors to know, is are they tapping into groundwater? The tourism, part of the tourism industry, for example, is saying we are putting in desalination units and the likes, and that's to get confidence in getting visitors there. But I think where we're going to be hit in industry is going to be in the food processing side, which is very large. And I think general business that is labor intensive, where people are not able to easily get their 50 liters per person per day, and the businesses are not affording that luxury to their staff. So my suggestion to them would be is to get people to work is to actually have potable water available for them so that they come to work to get the 50 liters per day, so that when they do go home in the evening or in the morning if they're working a night shift, at least they've got the security of supply and they can focus on the job, etc., etc. So I think there's quite a few things that need to be done. I think business in general is scared to speak about it because they don't want to create panic and they don't want the opposition to know how vulnerable they may be.
Tom, can I ask you, in the agricultural sector, have we had reports of vulnerability there yet? Have they seen? Are they seeing feeling the effects? Or will that only be in the next season?
Oh, no, Bridgetti. I mean, this is slammed very hard into agriculture already. In mind is that the farming communities have obviously been fairly aware that this risk was rising. Our own particular instance on our farm back in April of 2017, we took a conscious decision at that time to parts of the farm, and we effectively wrote off about 40% of our crops. And we actually took the right decision. We had just coming through, first of all, from the irrigation scheme, and secondly, from our own borehole structure to allow us to bring in part of the crop. The effect is devastating. I mean, all farms essentially have been tossed into a loss. And in some situations, on those farms, for example, the biggest loss is expected to be in the seasonal worker area. The harvests is diminished, so therefore the work for seasonally so-called piece workers, that is diminished as well. Families out there that live on the farms or live in the rural communities, they are really suffering. And there's no relief. It's not as though they can say, well, I'll go to the farm next door. They're in just as bad shape. Or they say, I can move to the next town. That town will be bad shape. The difficulty is does everyone sort of hunker down and see if they can survive? Or do they start to leave cities in the hope of finding work there? That's the big fear, is that you start to have some sort of mass movement of people. And you must bear in mind that these are people all their lives. They might be in their middle years now, and they don't necessarily have any particular skills that they can use in a they drive tractors, or they prune, or they are knowledgeable on irrigation, but they can't be turned overnight into factory workers or anything like that. So it's a really difficult situation. And you know, some of our chaps have, for example, they've got children, very proud, in colleges, some of the younger ones in boarding schools. How do they afford it? Very, very difficult situation for them. And of course, you can't grow half an apple or a quarter of an orange. You either have enough water to grow things or you don't. And if you don't, you just have to put those plants off to utilize the rest of your water, concentrate it on those parts of the farm that you think will give you the best result. But my big fear is because the sorts of figures that we've been talking about have assumed that there's no allocation to agriculture. It's only, let's say, 160 million cubic meters of water additional into the dams. The agriculture needs something like 80 to 100 million cubic meters of that water. Otherwise, they don't get to grow crops again. And then it will be really, but this year they could kind of work their way through it with their reserves, but next year there'll be nothing left. Did we lose you for a moment?
Sorry, I lost sound there for a moment. I couldn't hear that last bit. Benoit, were you able to hear that last bit?
Yes, I could hear, and I think Tom's talking about next season. Will there be an allocation at all next season for agriculture? And I think, you know, we're all focusing on the city, but the city is also dependent on agriculture and vice versa. And I think the conundrum, if we park day zero, I think the conundrum is the damage over this next season or two that's done to the local economy. And whilst chugging away at 50 liters per day, and let's say we never get to phase 2 or 25 liters per day. And I don't know how one changes the focus into it, because people are not normally looking past next payday next month. You know, we're talking here 6 to 12 to 18 months. And I think, and the ripple effect in the economy and in the city because of agriculture not getting adequate water next season is absolutely immense. And it's actually a national issue. It's not just a regional issue. It's a national issue.
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. If you look at the job situation, at least about 600,000 people in the Southwestern Cape are employed in the agribusiness, either on the farms or in the rural towns, in the city, in the metro. And to the extent that we are hearing reports of industries that fruit being down 20, 30%, the grape harvest being down by similar amounts, these have a massive effect. That means, you know, so many fewer bottles of jam or of chutney or whatever it is that would otherwise have been produced. And with that go all the jobs that is associated with it. So the knock-on effect is very, very big, particularly in an area like this, which is dependent on the agricultural industry. It's very, very important that somehow this is not cause to extend any further than it has to. And enough rain and enough water into the system to allow the farmers to start up normally in that sort of September, October timeframe next year. Because if they're at that time, then they can't water the plants when they're blossoming, which means the plants will toss the blossoms off, in which case there'll be no fruit at all. So there's also a timing aspect which is very, very critical. Now, what you do need to take into account, of course, is the augmentation initiative. You want to extend into that this evening, but that could make a big difference to the actual amount of good quality water that is available, and to the that we get some rain and that the dams do refill to a certain point. Then if the augmentation flow reservoirs is sufficient, then the city can be diminishing its draw on the dams, and more of that water can therefore be available to agriculture for the enormous problem that they've had this year.
Well, I think what one can say without a doubt. Go ahead, Benoit.
So you touch on a point that was lingering in the front of my mind there, Tom, is on the augmentation is somewhat of a wild card, because that will afford agriculture to get some of its quota back with, let's say, with normal rains, not even extreme rains. But the problem with augmentation is that there's zero credibility in what's been put forward, because there is still only 22 or 26 megalitres a day coming through. And there's the whole issue with the groundwater, where the quality, they're talking quantities, they're not talking qualities. And the qualities, if that groundwater has to be treated, which most of it has to an extent, has to either be put through a decentralized water treatment plant or fed into, and that depends how far it is, fed into one of the Cape Town's water treatment plants. And that whole logistical exercise is a big and expensive one. And I don't believe we're going to get before the next summer, 100, 120 megalitres a day, although the target is 180, 200. I just don't physically see the treatment and the likes, because information is not out there. I'm not in the inner circle, so I don't know. So I'm saying that the likelihood of that having more than 100 megalitres a day impact is low, unless new information comes to light. And even at 200 megalitres a day, which is the number being touted about, I think, at the moment, that is not going to change the 50 litres per person per day. It's going to allow agriculture to get a quota, but it's still going to keep, I think, the Cape Town urban area under duress. To me, 50 litres per person per day is duress.
Either way, the situation's not going to ease up anytime soon. And I think the message that needs to go out is that we cannot slack our hand at saving, because already the agriculture has been affected, business has been affected, our economy is starting to see the effects. And if there's any chance we stop saving to the extent that we currently are, it means we'll just be in bigger trouble sooner than later.
Bridgetti,
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think we have to be safe at the level that we've been doing up to now. You know, right at the most recent figures from the city are that the city is still using about 510 roughly megalitres per day on average. But of that, they're only drawing about 480 from the dams. So in other words, there is an augmentation flow now of about 24, 25 million litres per day, which is starting to come in from the work that they're doing with the springs, the mountain springs and things like that. Now, as I understand it, their hope is to get up to about 80 megalitres end of June, and to lift that figure by the end of the year to maybe 120 to 150 megalitres per day. Apparently will include an update on that. So I'm expecting to come away from that meeting with a good idea as to, first of all, what the expectations are. what they're expecting to achieve through the different augmentation initiatives which are running at the moment. The range of 120 to 150 million litres of water per day, other than from the dams, then the situation starts to change somewhat. The situation. Bridgetti?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Benoit, did you have any closing comments?
I think Tom's covered it very well, and I think it's the big challenge is how does the city package this information so that the focus is changed as to a target as opposed to a date, and how to maintain the message through that the savings. It's not a 150-day story for 50 litres per person per day. It's an ongoing thing until there's a major impact in the dams and augmentation. How one packages that information is a difficult task, and I think that communication is absolutely key. And it sounds like that's where the city is starting to focus, to get a clear, succinct message that everybody can understand.
I think that is going to be the key moving forward, that there is a succinct message that everyone understands, that we're all on the same page and we all understand that there's no quick fix for this. I personally, I don't want to accept that we're going to have to live like this for the next 10 years. We'd like to see things improve, our quality of life, business, agriculture, we need to flourish. But in order for anything to change, we have to drive home the message that we need to save water. We cannot slack our hands. Tom, did you have any other thoughts in closing?
I think we've done this evening, Bridgetti. It's be interesting to hear what the city has to say tomorrow. I think the augmentation side of it is very, very important. I have suspected more progress there than they've been telling us so far, and if that's the case, that will be helpful. But for the rest of it, I think it's a question of saving and making sure that we do get to June, to the rainy period, with a reasonable amount of water still in the dams. We can only get by with what we've got at the moment. The augmentation is not going to bring much in the coming few months, so it's all very reliant on us just as long as we can to try to get past the point of survival.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Benoit, thank you very much for your contribution this evening. Tom, thank you very much for your contribution.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.